Okay, this is an addendum to our Jeremiah study. We, after a year and a half in Jeremiah, we just wanted a little bit more of Jeremiah, so we're going into the Book of Lamentations. And I will tell you that I am not really knowledgeable about the Book of Lamentation, and that's another good reason to study it. In fact, I thought Lamentations only had 3 chapters, and that's one reason I wanted to add it. I thought, 3 chapters, we'll get through that rather quickly. It's 5 different chapters, and each of those chapters are called a dirge. Are you familiar with the term dirge? D-I-R-G-E. That's a funeral song. And so each of the 5 chapters are a separate song written. We would say a poem, but a poem written in talking about Judah falling and them going into captivity. So let's look at several things before we get into Lamentations itself about about the book as we go here. First, it's called a mournful postscript. So we have finished Jeremiah, they have gone into captivity, and so this is a little script put on the end of that story to Jeremiah, to the book of Jeremiah. It has, as I said, 5 dirges or funeral laments that the author grieved over Jerusalem's fate and recognized that it was because of her sin. So there's no watering down, there is no making Jerusalem and Judah into a victim here. They're saying grieving because of the punishment basically that Jerusalem earned by turning away from God. Charles Swindoll said this about it. With 5 dirges, it is a mute reminder, the Book of Lamentations, that sin, in spite of all its allurement and excitement, carries with it heavy weights of sorrow. And that's the truth. They say, the old phrase they say about eating dessert, too much dessert, is a second on the lips, a lifetime on the hips. Well, the same thing can be said for Jerusalem. It seemed like a lot of fun to turn away from God and invest in the most modern things and the most modern attitudes and the gods of the people around them who did really fun things until it came time to pay. And then there's sorrow, grief, misery, barrenness, and pain. It is the other side. The Book of Lamentations is the flip side of the coin for eat, drink, and be merry. And that was Charles Swindoll. So the title, Lamentations, is taken from the Hebrew, the first word in Hebrew, which is ekah, and it means, this says alas or how. I would say what or why. So it is the very first word is what's happening, why did this happen, that kind of thing. But that was in Hebrew. Lamentations is actually from the Latin Vulgate title. And so, a lot of our English words are Latin in origin. 65% of the words we have in English are from Latin. So Lamentations is one, we don't use the word lament a ton, but it is in an English word over from the Latin. Latin Vulgate, as you know, was the Catholic translation. So St. Jerome translated early, within several hundred years after Jesus ascended. He began translating the Hebrew Old Testament, probably a lot of the Greek Old Testament and the Greek New Testament over into Latin because that was the language of the Catholic Church. And it's come back to us. Most people also followed the Jewish tradition, ascribing the Book of Lamentations to Jeremiah. I know of very few. Now, there are some secular scholars. That began to be challenged in the 1700s, like a lot of things. 1700s, we had the Renaissance, and people started questioning things a lot. Um, but in general, most people ascribe it to Jeremiah. In the end, it doesn't really matter. We affirm that God is speaking to us through the Scripture, and it doesn't matter. It really is kind of immaterial what human author wrote down the words of God. That is a human concern. Now, who actually wrote this down? Can we trust that person? Well, we've lost that. And I think that's part of the reason that most authors in the Bible are anonymous. I mean, including the book of Genesis. Now, tradition tells us that Moses wrote it, but he did not sign the book of Genesis. We don't have an original with his signature on it. He doesn't say in there, I, Moses, wrote this, because in the end, if we believe that God is the ultimate author, that human who wrote it down is just doing their part in the process of transmission. So anyway, thus the title of the book in English is usually, that should be usually, the Lamentations of Jeremiah. That you might recognize the word Septuagint. That is the Greek version of the Old Testament. So originally the Old Testament was chanted. It was memorized and chanted. And so it was passed along orally. People would memorize it. And as the newfangled technology of writing stuff down it coincided or came together with the chanting of the Bible, originally in Hebrew, they just had consonants. And so there was no punctuation, there was no spaces in between words. So if you could imagine the sentence, I walked to the store, and you took out all the A, E, I, O, and U's, and then pushed all the letters together and put no punctuation on either end, that's the way the Bible was originally written down in Hebrew. Now, what good would that do to a line of letters? It would look like gibberish. Well, that might be true unless you had memorized the sentence, I walked to the store. Then you could see it exactly, very easily. And so originally, the written language was only a prompt for the memory. And so you had memorized the book of Genesis, and so you could follow on the page, and it was just to remind you where you were at. If a bird chirped or somebody hollered over there and everybody looked over, if you had your finger on the letter, you'd know exactly where you were in chanting the book of Genesis. Anyway, it was in Hebrew for 1,100 years, 1,200, maybe 1,300 to 1,500 years. It had been written down in Hebrew. And then, of course, those copies would disintegrate after 50, 60 years and be copied onto a new place. Anyway, copies of copies of copies. About 200 years before Jesus was born, it was still in Hebrew, but the world was starting to write things down a lot. And the written language, the lingua franca, it wasn't actually lingua franca because that's more the trade language, but the educated language, the language of educated people was Greek. And so the Septuagint was, by tradition, 70 Hebrew Bible scholars got together in Alexandria, Virginia for 70 days, and they translated from Hebrew into Greek the Old Testament, or the Pentateuch. Initially, it was just the first 5 books, the Torah. And so normally, a lot of times you'll see, instead of Septuagint, you'll see LXX. And that is the Roman Latin number for 70, LXX. So L being 50, X being 10, and X being 10, 70. So anyway, the Greek Old Testament added the following words in the introduction. Now, let me put a little caveat in there, a little warning. There's no such thing as the Septuagint. There are tons and tons of different versions. If you go and look, occasionally I want to see what it said in the Greek version of the Old Testament when I'm looking at a word in English and then in Hebrew, and I want to compare and see what they said in Greek. I'll look at it. What I'm looking at is an edited version where they take all the manuscripts that we have and they've edited them together and decided what is the most original reading. So you say the old Greek versions kind of edited together, added the following words. So the version that has been passed to us, and it came to pass, after Israel was taken captive, and Jerusalem was made desolate, that Jeremiah sat weeping and lamented with this lamentation over Jerusalem. And he said, and that was the prelude to the text we have. The Aramaic was the lingua franca at that time. That was the trade language. And as you know, most likely Jesus spoke Aramaic. Apparently he could read both Greek and Hebrew according to what the New Testament says. But a lot of things were translated into Aramaic, including the Targums. It's called the Aramaic Targum of Jonathan. I'm not really familiar with it. The Babylonian Talmud, the Peshitta, which is in Syriac, the language Syriac, and the Vulgate all made statements attributing the work to Jeremiah. So when we say the tradition says it's Jeremiah, it is a very old tradition. I know the Peshitta goes back to 200 BC or further back. So we're talking about 2,200-year-old at least tradition that this is Jeremiah. I don't know what you think about that, but I find it interesting. So internal evidence means when you read it and are reasoning through what the text of Lamentation itself says, also points to Jeremiah as the author. There are several common ideas used by Jeremiah in his prophecy in the book of Jeremiah that reappear in Lamentations in both works. The writer said his eyes flowed with tears in several different places. The writer said that he was an eyewitness to Jerusalem's fall to Babylon, and it also pictured the atrocities that befell Jerusalem in her last days in both books. Very vivid pictures of what that is like. So assuming that Jeremiah was the author of the book itself must have, when was it composed? When was it written down? So it was composed after Babylon fell in 586, but before he was taken to Egypt. If you remember, in the last part of Jeremiah, that Gedaliah had been made governor, and he was assassinated somewhere around 583 to 582 BC. And the survivors after Gedaliah's assassination fled to Egypt. If you remember, they asked Jeremiah, "Should we go? Jeremiah made them wait 10 days. Said, "I've asked God over and over," and He said, "No, don't go to Egypt." They said, "We're going anyway." Vivid descriptions and deep emotions expressed in the Book of Lamentations argue for a composition sometime shortly after those events, because it was still very fresh, apparently in the mind of the author. So probably very soon after the fall of Jerusalem. All the heartaches and hardships experienced by Jerusalem in the Book of Lamentations had been predicted 900 years earlier by Moses. There is, and I didn't want to go through it, but there was a chart that mapped out all 5 dirges of Lamentations and then showed how they resonated with Deuteronomy 28. And so I'll give you 2 that I use Sunday scriptures. In the farewell speech of Moses, they were on the banks of the Jordan River. getting ready to cross into the promised land. And, and he gave many speeches, but including this one where he said, all these blessings, and he goes on to say blessings, your crops will grow, your children will prosper, there'll be safety on all sides. All these blessings will come upon you and go with you if you obey the Lord your God. And you remember, Jeremiah was kind of the consequence inherent in the old covenant, the covenant made with Moses. And that is, if you obey God, God will bless you, but if you do not. However, if you do not obey God and do not carefully follow all his commands, all these curses will come upon you. Very much reflected in the Book of Lamentations. And it's kind of sad. And that's why, I say the book of Jeremiah is a warning for us all. We're not under the old covenant, but Jesus fulfilled the old covenant. We're under the new covenant, which is a covenant of forgiveness. But the problem with forgiving people's sins is that sometimes they can get lax about their holiness. That's the flaw in Christianity. We are forgiven. Once you get saved, you're going to heaven. People get lazy. Because we're sinful, we get lazy about our holiness. Christians should work hard to be righteous people. We should work hard all the time, not to watch what the world does. We don't want to be like Judah. We don't want to blend in with the crowd like Judah did, and they were punished for it. We're not going to get punished for blending in with the crowd. We're forgiven, but it makes us struggle. We struggle. It would almost be better in some ways for God to hold a whip to us. And that was the old covenant. The old covenant was sort of a whip. And so I'm thankful to be under the new covenant, but I think we take advantage of it. John?
Excuse me. Society is so depraved today, we don't fit in.
Well, hopefully.
The gay rights parades and all the debauchery and
hopefully
it's crazy.
We're not supposed to fit in. But you know what? I'll guarantee you, you look at any of those crowds, and if the people that had been baptized turned purple, there'd be a lot of shame at that parade. And that's the thing. We are blending in. And because we have been forgiven, should work so hard in appreciation. We should cooperate with the Holy Spirit to become holier and holier, to flee from sin, to live righteous faith.
All through the Old Testament, you see how God judged Israel for
Yes.
their sin.
Yes.
Well, has God changed?
God has not changed. Now,
what do you think He's doing in this country?
Well, yes.
He's not changed.
I agree. And so it is an important idea. It's slippery to me even as I think about it, because we are not bound by the old covenant. We live in a covenant of grace. We live by the new covenant of forgiveness of our sins. I will remember your sins no more. And so God said, I'm given, and that's the importance of Jeremiah. Jeremiah 31:31. I'm giving you a new covenant because you have not kept the covenant that I made with your ancestors. And so the big switch, I'll give you my opinion. Okay, so everybody take out your red flag and wave it, your warning flag, because Rex is giving his opinion. I believe the old covenant was given as a discipleship course for the Hebrews ex-slaves, to teach them human responsibility and what holiness meant. You cannot be holy without a sense of responsibility for your own sin. A slave does not live a life of responsibility. And so God had pulled them to Him. He had saved them, and He gave them the old covenant and the laws in order to teach them how to live a holy life. Why did he do it? Because Jesus was coming, and he did not want Jesus to be born to pagans, polytheistic pagans, be born as a result of a sinful fertility ritual. And so he said, I'm going to take this people. I'm just going to randomly select these people, the Hebrews, and I'm going to save them, and then I'm going to give them law and teach them what holiness looks like. And so that covenant was stipulated on obedience to the course. But the intention all along was the new covenant. That man could not pay. Man could not be good enough to earn salvation. Man could not pay their own thing. Everything we believe about what Jesus did on the cross was in the Old Testament. Numbers 35:33. Atonement cannot be made for blood spilled on the land except by him who spilt the blood, who shed it. Everybody's responsible for their own sin. And the blood being shed in the ground is a reference back to Cain. I believe in the story of Cain and Abel. Figuratively, we are Cain and Abel is Jesus. And we take Jesus out and we slaughter him. We spill blood on the ground. Every sin, every time we sin, we're putting Jesus' blood on the ground. And we cannot pay for that except with our eternal soul. All right, what does the New Testament add to that? Nothing. And so God, his plan all along was the forgiveness of sin. I believe at the moment of salvation, our soul is cleansed of sin. That's why, and that's a supernatural thing. That's not by joining up and getting dipped in the baptismal pool. None of that does anything to wipe the sin off our soul. That only the Holy Spirit of God can take the sin off our soul. And so we can't put it back on. Once we get saved, we sin in the flesh because of the habit of the flesh. And so the new covenant was God's plan all along. Now, I don't know how the old covenant salvation and new covenant salvation is going to work. That's a mystery that I cannot fully unpack. And what I'm hitting at there is are the old covenant people saved in the same way that we are saved? I don't fully know the answer. I have suspicions, but it is a divine mystery what God is going to do with people before Jesus. I kind of think that we get a few little hints at that where it says, in those 3 days Jesus went down to Sheol and preached to the souls. I think he's preaching to the people that came before, but it's not A, B, C, D clear for us all. Anyway, what I know is that we are living God's plan. God planned to forgive our sins. What's the problem to leave us? We are already not yet saved. So if you die and you've asked Jesus into your heart and you've committed your life to him, then your soul has been cleansed, and the moment you die, you wake up at Judgment Day and pass through the fire and go to eternity with God. All right? I've got caught in the weeds here. Anyway, see, I'm trying to join y'all with a senior moment right there in the middle of it.
I didn't know he passed through the fire. What are you talking about?
I'm talking about 2 Peter 3:10, with the earth will pass away with fire. And so I think everything, all physical, everything made of matter and atoms, including our flesh, will be burned to purify. And I take that to mean 2 Peter 3:10. Fire in the Old Testament is purifying. After they would make the sacrifice, they would bring a goat in, and they would put their hands on a ram for the sin offering. They'd put their hand on the goat, and they would pray for sin to be transferred from the people onto the ram. And then they would kill that ram. And so the ram gave its life as a penalty, a substitutionary penalty for the sins of the people for 1 year. And they would collect the blood because the life is in the blood, and now the blood has been purified. And they would take that blood and they would sprinkle it on the ark, and they would use it to cleanse. So the whole Day of Atonement the cleansed blood, the blood after that animal has died for the sins of whomever, the priest, the temple worker, the tabernacle workers, and then all of the people, that blood was cleansed, and they could purify and clean off the sin stains off the tabernacle, right? And so then, what did they do with the carcass after they had drained the pure blood?
I know they burned part of it.
They put it up on the brazen altar and burned away the flesh because the flesh has still got sin in it. All right, and so I'm jumping around quite a bit, but my thought is that 2 Peter 3:10, the earth will pass away in a conflagration, a big fire, a loud noise, and a big fire. That is the purification of matter. Everything touched by sin has to pass through the fire and be purified. Now, what is left of you and me, John, after our sinful flesh has been purified? Our soul passes through. So that I was assuming. Thank you for calling me out and having me explain it. I was assuming a lot of common knowledge there, but that's why I put that together. That's where I got that phrase.
Okay,
Is it all matter? That's that judgment day will be after all matter. And I believe the souls with sin on them still go into the eternal lake of fire. All right? And so that's the difference. Our soul will pass through the fire. Theirs will pass to the fire. Everything touched with sin is fire is purifying for sin. That's why Isaiah 6:5. Isaiah says, "Woe is me, for I'm a sinful man. I speak unclean words." And what does the seraphim do? He comes and takes a coal off the fire and touches his lips to purify them. Fire is always purifying. And so there'll be some kind of explosion, apparently, at the end of time. And my favorite verse is 2 Peter 3:9. The Lord is not slack concerning his promise to return. Because people are saying Jesus hadn't come back and we're starting to die. What's going on here? Peter says he's not slack, but he's long-suffering, unwilling that any should perish. And then he goes into verse 10 and he says, because you know what's going to happen one day with a loud noise and a fire, this earth, heaven and earth will pass away, and behold, a new heaven and earth will come. And so there's going to be an explosion in the fire, and the sin is going to be purified off of all matter. And then that matter is going to collapse into, be a gas ball and collapse back into a planet and be redone. And so I tend to think that after we pass into eternity, pass through the fire purification, we'll be back on the reconstituted earth with a reconstituted body.
For a millennium.
Yes. I think the millennium will happen before the big boom. I think that is the closing act of humanity before the boom. So now that's a lot. I put together a lot, and I didn't mean to go that. Well, that's a big old rabbit we just chased down the hole, isn't it? But just the point is talking about that Old Testament, that Old Covenant, which I think the chickens come home to roost in the book of Jeremiah, but it's referring back to this Old Covenant of obedience and disobedience, blessing and curses. And I believe that was a temporary thing. Now, as I said Sunday, I don't think that the Old Covenant has fully passed away. And the reason I say that is because there are some land stipulations, territorial things that have not been fulfilled in the Old Covenant yet. God promised to extend their borders to the Euphrates, the borders of Israel. It hadn't happened yet. And so I can't really work this out. Boy, I'm bringing up more questions than answers here, I fear. But you know what? We're here to study and learn, and they say you don't learn unless you're stretched and become uncomfortable with what you already know. So anyway, I'm giving you some questions to stretch you, but we definitely are under the new covenant. And Paul's big thing, Paul, we could say Paul articulated Christianity as we understand it. God is the author of Christianity. Paul put it down on paper for us. And his biggest problem was these people wanting to go back to the old covenant, making it obedience, obedience, obedience. That's gone. Jesus was obedient. And we plug in at Jesus. And so the covenant has been fulfilled as far as what we are supposed to do for the covenant. Now we're in the new covenant that Jeremiah talked about. That book of consolation, right in the middle of Jeremiah, he said, I'm going to write my words on your heart. You're going to be my people inherently. Because you want to be, not because you're compelled. And you don't have to act, but if you really love me, you're going to want to act. You're going to want to be holy. So that's what I'm getting at there. Any questions about that? But it's very important. There's a very tight valency between that old covenant structure and the author of Lamentations showing how the people failed to keep their part of that covenant and how he is very sad about Jerusalem falling, but it is justice. God kept his promises. Fortunately for Judah, God also promised to bring them back from captivity. So, like so many times in the Old Testament, we get to the darkest day in the Bible and there's a glimmer of hope. In the Old Testament, I'm teaching about the book of Judges. You remember, we went through Judges and it gets wilder and wilder and wilder. And they just, by the last several chapters, they're just Israelite finding Israelite. They almost wipe out Benjamin. And then there's that weird story in the last chapter where the young virgins are dancing up the hill towards Shiloh, and the Benjamites hide in the bushes and run out and grab them one. That's very bizarre, but that's just a glimmer of hope. Benjamin is not going to pass away, even though they sort of deserve it. Benjamin did the crime, now they're doing their time, but God kept a remnant alive, and that's the way of the Bible. Back to Lamentations. Are you familiar with the word chiasm? Do you know what a chiasm is? A chiasm, say you have 5 sentences in a poem, and you write a chiastic poem. The first line and the 5th line would be very similar in subject. And then you would have the 2nd line and the 4th line would be very similar. And then they all come to a head, to a point in line 3. That's a chiasm. Think of it kind of that way. And so most people recognize, one, it is an acrostic, the Book of Lamentations in Hebrew. An acrostic would be if you wrote a poem and the first line started with A, the 2nd line started with B, the 3rd line did with C, following the alphabet. Or an acrostic would be if I wrote I love Sarah and then wrote her a poem with I, starting with L, starting O, that would be an acrostic. And so the Book of Lamentations in Hebrew is an acrostic, and it has a chiastic structure. And so you can kind of see there, Jerusalem's desolation in the first dirge would be parallel with the remnant's response to all of that in chapter 5, or in dirge number 5. God's judgment in chapter 2 would be parallel with the Lord's anger in chapter 4. And the point of the chiasm would be chapter 3, Jeremiah's response to God's judgment. So just a little interesting side point on the Book of Lamentations. So the first dirge, or chapter 1, establishes the theme of the book. So let's look at that. Sorrow in Jerusalem. And so I've numbered 3 different ways that Jerusalem has changed, important ways. Jerusalem, once so full of people, is now deserted. That's the full one. The people have gone. Likely, Jeremiah, the author, is standing on the Mount of Olives looking back and looking at the city burning, looking at the stones being drug away, and just thinking of people coming in and out to go to the festivals. And he's like, it was just a thriving city. People crawling, people everywhere. and now it's gone. You can imagine going to I-40 and there being no cars. The way it used to be. No more. She who was once great among nations, as a secular nation right on the hub of the wheel, all the trade caravans came by Jerusalem. And so economically, Jerusalem prospered, great among nations, now sits alone like a widow. And I've got a verse in a moment about a widow. But a widow is destitute in the ancient world. As we've said many times, there are only 3 jobs for women in the ancient world. That is daughter, wife, and prostitute. And so a widow is kind of out in the cold in the ancient world. They didn't have entitlements for a widow. If their family did not, if they had no family to take them in, then they were a beggar. Too old, a widow is too old to be a prostitute, and so they have to beg. So it's a poignant image that is kind of lost on us. Widow doesn't carry the same connotation now as it did in Bible times. Once great, once everybody wanted a date with Jerusalem. Now she's a widow and she is crawling through the gutter looking for scraps. Once Jerusalem was the queen of all the earth. Now she is a slave. And so just that quick cross-reference on widow. In Isaiah 1:7, for example, Isaiah is giving advice. He says, learn to do good, seek justice in the way you carry yourself, reprove the ruthless, stand up to people who are taking advantage of weaker people, defend the orphan. The orphan is very parallel to the widow. It talks about the widow and the orphan, and plead for the widow. You know, in the book of James, it says this is pure and undefiled religion, to visit the widow and the orphan in their trouble. Those are those who truly are destitute and have nothing. Faye?
In studying the New Testament in Jesus' time,
Yes.
it seems to me like in Jesus' time, their financial situation was in a mess. There was Greek people who lived there that had their own currency.
Mm-hmm.
There was tax collectors' dues.
Yeah.
There was money changing tables. And those people took advantage of uneducated people.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of poor people.
There were a lot of poor people.
It seems to me like it was in a mess.
And I've said it many times, in America, we have very few destitute people. I have met a couple here and there, but it is a great exception. What we call poor are people that have a very fixed income that is not enough to do whatever they want to whenever they want to. We don't have destitute people who don't know, where they're going to get supper. That just doesn't happen. Even homeless people. I remember when I worked in New York City, a young man said he was homeless and he had chosen to go homeless. He had been in the Navy when I believe it was the Iowa blew up in Norfolk, and he went AWOL after it blew up and went to New York City, and he started out just hanging out and drinking and partying. And he said, this isn't so bad. And so he chose to go homeless. And he said to me, he said, nobody goes hungry in New York City. You just got to learn where to go, and you eat buffet every meal. And so that's kind of the truth. And so we don't have poverty like this. A widow, when, the story underneath the book of Ruth, Naomi's husband had property, but Naomi could not benefit from that property. She could not farm it. She could not sell it. She could not get any kind of income. And so she would stand there on ostensibly what we would say her own land with no access to her. What did she need? She had to have a redeemer to connect us. And I've told you, I think that's metaphorical for us, for our relationship with God. And, you think about the land of Canaan, where the Garden of Eden was. That is our land where we are with God. And it's there, but we cannot access it without a redeemer. We need somebody to redeem us so that we can be with God, be in the land. And so a widow, even if property belonged to her husband, even if her husband was wealthy, if he dies and there has not been some arrangement made for her, she can't have the money. It's not like we are today. And so when it says she was great among the nations, people were trading with her. Jerusalem was wealthy. People admired the temple. It was considered one of the wonders of the seven wonders of the ancient world. People went there. People were coming and going. And now it is a widow. It goes on in verse 2. She sobs through the night. Tears stream down her cheeks. Among all her lovers that she had before, as Judah was turning its back on God, more and more the lovers are those who could make it wealthy, make it popular. They like to dress in the latest fashion. They like to have the entertainments that Aram had and Moab had and Assyria had and all the nations. They wanted to be important. All her friends have betrayed her and become her enemies. And that is lamentable. And if it's Jeremiah or if it's another, they are looking back in great sadness. Now, as we go through, we're going to stop there for today. As we go through this book, this writer will say, in effect, Jerusalem's not a victim. This didn't happen accidentally, but it was because she turned her back on the Lord. And so I think it has a lot to say for us. We're going to, as I say, stop there, and we'll pick up there next week in verse 3. Any questions?